So, in keeping with the topic, mingling practice with daily life, and so I was thinking about what could we do in terms of topic that could be discussed. And I think one way to look at it would be the essential understanding that needs to be there in the minds of all meditators, which is not to discriminate or differentiate, separate meditation and whatever we consider to be practice, meditation or practice. So part what we spoke about last evening also in the same way, learnings or studying of the Dharma, anything that we understand and analyze and meditate upon and consider to be essential. There's a path of learning, path of understanding, path of analyzing and meditating upon it so that the mind becomes familiar with whatever we have studied. Familiarity leads to understanding whether or not that what we are practicing and learning and hearing and contemplating makes sense. And so upon analysis and examination and deepened contemplation, if the mind of that individual person, meditator or practitioner begins to see sense and understand the meaning to make sense and is of some value, then that is what becomes the essence of the practice. That no longer then remains a spiritual path or a spiritual practice, but needs to become the essence that is integrated in one's own life. And so from that perspective, traditionally, one would talk about generating absolute devotion, faith or confidence into the path of practice and learning. Now, while devotion or confidence is, in some respect, we could say, not difficult to generate, or it should be the simplest. One should simply, if I may use the phrase, jump into it and have no doubt and hesitation about it. And so from that perspective, we would say we are trying to learn about wisdom or loving kindness, something that can be of beneficial to all sentient beings, wanting to liberate all sentient beings, wanting to exhaust ignorance, arrogance, jealousy, desire, hatred, anger, ignorance. And so how much should a person hesitate into jumping and developing confidence in knowing that this needs to be done? So from that way, Vajrayana teachings especially talk about being a swift path. And the swiftness comes about because of lessened hesitation and doubt. Hesitation and doubt often that which arises from a small voice in our own mind telling us not to take that leap, not to jump forward. Two ways of looking at it. One is we often tend to trust that voice of hesitation and doubt, but then not realizing that whom we are trusting is our own habitual tendency. However wise it may arise and say sensible things as you are not ready for it, or you're not up to it, or you're not qualified for it. Nevertheless, whom we are trusting is our own basic ignorance. We are trying to again listen to the wisdom of a mind that wants to revert back into its own habitual ways of doing things, habitual patterns, habitual distractions, habitual lacking in the courageous approach towards generating something that is valuable. And so oftentimes we listen to it, we assume that this is a sensible thing to do it. That's the sad part of it. On the other hand, the other extreme would be is where we don't really know what we're jumping into and blindly jump into it. Let's say generating that absolute trust. And as in many of the texts we say, a dog attempts a lion's leap and often ends up in the abyss, not being able to go across simply because we do tend to generate enthusiastic confidence and leap into trusting the path of the practices, however, with inadequate research and analysis and understanding of what we are getting into. And often on the path encounter again difficulties and obstacles, especially where we haven't penetrated our hesitations and doubts, and therefore again encounter difficulties. Therefore, devotion must be dependent upon clear analysis and examination. And therefore, from that broad perspective, the beginning of the teachings that arose from the instructions of Buddha Shakyamuni are absolutely true and beneficial, and one should generate absolute confidence in it. Nevertheless, because we encounter difficulties and obstacles of our own habitual patterns, of our own familiar patterns. And therefore, because of that, in accordance to the instructions of Shakyamuni Buddha, it is essential that all meditators also realize the importance of the three prajnas: listening, contemplating, examining, meditating carefully. Through careful understanding of the Dharma, through the path of listening to the teachings, through studying of the teachings, they're not only listening and studying, but retaining it and chewing it, so to speak, through proper thinking, through proper analysis. Does it make sense? How does a certain thing mean? If this is being presented as the teachings, does it have any relevance to one's own individual experience and the experience of all sentient beings? Qualities that are being asked to develop, does that really make sense? Is it really necessary? Does it seem to be the sensible thing to develop? Those different tendencies that are being referred to as defilements, as objects of rejection and abandonment, again, is it necessary? Is it true? In the level of one's own experiences, how much of these teachings are relevant to one's own self and make sense to us as being truly necessary, that need to be adopted by a person endowed with the quality of prajna, or simple common sense. And so being able to contemplate upon them and then researching on them, analyzing them. Research and analysis, as much as theoretical and philosophical examination should be carried, similar to that, experiential examination must also be there. As a human being, happiness and suffering, and the manifold experiences that we are going to talk about, or that which are presented within the teachings, it's not about an experience that we don't have. It's not about a third person that we are talking about. It's about one's own individual self living in this world with all the experiences, and therefore, experientially, how does it feel? Suffering, and what is talked about as suffering, how does it feel in my body system, in my mental system, physical system? Happiness, that we all talk about as being necessary to achieve, or what we aspire to achieve, what does that happiness actually mean? And so from that way, we could say almost sensing these different things that we are talking about. If it is peace and happiness, joyfulness and generosity, loving kindness and compassion that we are talking about, physically, mentally beginning to experience what flavor, what nature these qualities mean, and therefore, what is it in the level of my experience? Likewise, negative tendencies or qualities that we are talking about as objects of abandonment, then again, experientially seeing and in everyday life knowing, oh, this is what is meant in the text as being happiness. This is what is meant by being suffering. This is meant by ignorance as it arises. Learning to actually have a much more deeper perspective of one's own individual experiences and how we interrelate with one another, that then can be said to be, oh, this is what the word means, so that no longer the hearing and the learning that we are doing seems to be a theoretical, philosophical, and solely contained within books and philosophies and tapes, and nothing relevant to what is happening in our individual life. If we separate it, then analysis and examination, even if we do so, often remains almost a very, let's say, sense of not feeling very connected to it. And therefore, we may meditate, but in terms of relating meditation into daily life, we bring about a separation. All the different qualities that we try to develop remain confined to the meditation cushion, or while we are in an environment of practice, and nothing that we seem to take into post-meditation or into daily life. For example, traditionally, as we study Dharma, probably one of the inadequacies that are there in the modern world's method of teaching is that method of teaching has become very much confined to a classroom-like situation, as this probably. As best as we could do, with your best of intentions and openness, and I'm sure that's exemplary. On the other hand, teachers do come and try and teach in the best of the situation. 10 to 12 is what our life has become. 10 to 12, 3 to 5 in most situations, let's say. So if you look at it, probably it's better. And as I always say, in comparison to not doing anything, let's say, it's always better that we do this. There's some benefit to it. But it's not the right way. This is then confining it to a classroom environment. It is about your saying certain things, my saying certain things, you're listening to them, and sort of being polite enough to not disagree. But again, giving ourselves enough space to forget about it the moment 12 o'clock comes. That's also there. And so traditionally, method of learning meant living a life of a practitioner. And as we grew up, even our generation has probably been one of the most fortunate in many ways, in that it went through a lot of transitions. Tibetan Buddhism especially went through a lot of transformation and transition. But also during that transformation and transition, we were blessed with some of the most remarkable teachers. Never in the history of Buddhism was there a situation where so many enlightened, great teachers were all born and leading and teaching at the same time, possibly all being there for that particular difficult time of transformation and transition that came about. But all of the teachers often emphasized living and being with them more than actually the one-to-one sort of talking and listening part of it. So when we grew up with some of our teachers, they would insist that we simply lived close by with them. And in those moments, every day was not a classroom situation. There were moments when formal teachings were given and one would listen, as we are doing here at this moment. But most of the times, of all the times, something that always was emphasized was simply living within that environment of practice, where each moment became, if one were able to look at it, a teaching. And so there was always an emphasis. For example, when teachers would give personal audiences to groups of people or to even individual, some of the teachers would always say, remain within the nearness or nearby the rooms and be able to listen, especially His Holiness Khandro Rinpoche, from whom we studied several years. Then Rinpoche would always say, your life is too limited and short to make all the mistakes yourself and then to recover from those mistakes or to learn from those mistakes. So simply being present in the room, one got to see many people who approached. Now, many of you have lived with teachers, so you're very familiar. Hardly anyone who goes to the teacher goes with the saying, everything is fine, I'm practicing very well, everything is good, all I need is your blessings and continued guidance. Most people come with, this is not right, this is not happening okay, I have this problem, I have that problem. And so especially among Tibetans, my tooth is aching, I have to the business is not happening well, the husband is not listening to you, the wife is not listening to you, the children are not listening to you. And so it's about all these problems. Gradually, we remember at one time we began to think, nowhere in this colony, the whole of the Tibetan settlement, there isn't anyone who's actually happy, who's actually, for someone who's, everything is going well. And so 50, 100 people who would come every day to see, out of that, it would be a lucky day if someone turned up with just being there to give respect, or so most of them would have some complaint or the other. But however, simple things, nevertheless, that which does give us the ability to take what we are looking in the form of words, in the form of philosophies, into daily life. Part reason, the difficulty in joining and uniting meditation and post-meditation, or theory into practice daily life, is we often relate to meditation and teaching as a medicine or as an antidote or as a tool that needs to be applied at certain moments when we encounter difficulties, not realizing that we encounter difficulties at every moment. What is there that is not an expression of our ego grasping? What is there as an experience in the field of our actions of body, speech, and mind that is not completely contaminated with ignorance, with aggression, with passion, with desire, with hatred, with jealousy, with just this inability to go beyond self-grasping? And therefore, teachings, if one were to completely mingle with our own daily experiences, there has to be the ability to experience every single moment and then look at it from the perspective of Dharma, look at it with the eyes of a meditator, not with the intention to criticize samsara and samsaric activities. Another extreme that many meditators go to, simply because we are practicing, we turn around and criticize everything that is mundane, that is ordinary. That's not necessary. That's part of our experience. The other extreme being ignoring it completely and being completely immersed and drowned within the experiences, having no basic awareness and sharpness of the wakefulness of seeing what is happening. Therefore, it becomes essential. When we talk about mingling practice with daily life, it simply becomes essential to take the analysis and the examination, the quality, the prajna, or the wisdom quality of examining into daily life. You listen to a sound, but as a meditator, you not only listen to a sound, but you listen to the sound with awareness, with the ability to know the fullness of the sound, rather than just either hearing the sound but not listening to it, or by listening and becoming completely drowned in the opinion of what that sound is. And so just the stickiness with which we listen to the sound. Similarly, when you look at something or situation, the circumstance, or a person, being able to really take what one has heard, what one has learned, into the vision, into the method of looking at that situation, beyond the two extremes of complete ignorance and judgment, and beyond the extremes of criticism and completely sort of negating what one is seeing. Looking at it properly, looking at it thoroughly. The same is with the thoughts too, is that thoughts as they arise, there is neither the necessity to take the extreme of criticism and blocking thoughts, neither the other extreme of completely being drawn into the judgments and the opinions of the thoughts that creates, again, insanity or the inability to clearly have a clear perspective and understanding of what the thoughts are. So it's about balance. Part reason, philosophically, Madhyamika, and the view and the schools of the different views that try to emphasize, and any teachings, specifically within the three yanas, Hinayana, Mahayana, Vajrayana, and specifically within the Mahayana teachings and the Vajrayana teachings, transformation and transcendence. All the different terms that we use is about creating a balance in the mind that is able to have a much more vast and a fuller view of the things that we see, of the sounds that we hear, as well as speak about, and particularly the thoughts that are generated, so that there comes about a vision or the perspective that is not separating between ordinary life and as a meditator. So when that doesn't happen, separation occurs, and much of all the, let's say, negativities or inability to integrate practice and daily life happens. And so let's say the current situation, perhaps a problem that has always been wherever meditators have been there, but particularly since we are people of this particular generation and we're responsible for that, a sense of being very good people, very good Buddhists, very good meditators comes about. In terms of respect and faith, confidence, devotion to the path of practice, I think it's exemplary. In terms of generating diligence and effort into the path of practice, you do exert a lot of effort. Far more than anyone else, you have given tremendous part of your life and effort into bringing about fruition, into bringing about some result from the practices. There's absolute dedication. Motivation is also very correct. But ultimately, what does seem to be an underlying current, which becomes a problem, is some tendency to see that as separate of one's own life. And so what happens is, when you are not within the environment of Sangha and community and meditation and the cushion, then there tends to be another part of yourself, almost a schizophrenic kind of a situation here, is where we have this dual personality. And so we have this person that many of us know who are not Buddhists, and possibly some friends among the Buddhists also. There's this whole personality of the person who still struggles with desire, attachment, selfishness, doubts, hesitations, and anger, aggression, hatred, whatever it may be. Then, however, this person seems to have no difficulty at the next moment to be on this cushion, or meditation cushion, and to be a perfectly serene person with genuine loving kindness to all sentient beings, and having some sense of longing, confidence, and faith to attain absolute understanding. Paul has also a deepened sense of understanding of what the empty nature is. And so the polarities of these two characteristics seem to go back and forth, and we don't mingle them. We don't unite them completely. Why we don't unite them completely, That is one question that one could ask in one's own self. And that then comes back to devotion, lacking in devotion. So there may be respect, there may be devotion, there may be confidence, there may be faith, whichever terms one may use. And at the same time, one may not have devotion, one may not have any confidence. And that again, probably, if we look carefully, is not having analyzed the teachings carefully. You've heard them, you've studied them, you know about them, but at the level of experience and really being able to see the essence of what is being spoken about, that may be weak. And because it is weak, the urgency of wanting to realize it, that may not be there. And the sense of what is more precious. In simple words, we could say what is more precious, samsara and nirvana. And confidence and wanting nirvana may be strong, yet it's still, in comparison to the flavors of samsara still are quite strong, quite entertaining. And therefore, because of that strength, while there is confidence in wanting nirvana, it's still not urgent enough to go beyond the flavors and the enjoyment of the flavors of samsara. And so these two constantly sort of go back and forth, in non-ability to integrate practice into daily life seems to stem out of then that lacking in thorough investigation of the essence of the teachings and adhering to many principles of meditation and practices, and yet in that adherence not being enough confidence to actually go beyond all those things that are what we know as being useless, what we know as being a sense of not being important. So from this perspective, one begins to then see why in the teachings of the Dharma, the three yanas have been sequentially placed in that way. Hinayana teachings, which talk about abandoning negative actions, cultivating positive actions. Mahayana, which stresses transformation of negative tendencies into positive qualities. And Vajrayana, which much stresses knowing the nature and from that genuine transcendence arising so that a spontaneous dissolution of the negative tendencies and may arise or spontaneously reveal the inner essence of the true nature. So if we look at just the three methods in which the three yanas are taught, one can see a progressive journey or a progressive path of training the mind in gaining confidence of what it is that we are talking about. And so from that perspective, although the absolute nature is inherent and we can remain within that, that's possibly the very easiest way to work with it. As a simple exercise, for example, briefly if we pause and take a breath out and you breathe out, within that out breath, if you pause for a brief moment, that's precisely where we should be at all times. How difficult can it be, isn't it? If you simply bring your mind to a one-pointed concentration, whether you look at a color or a form or a picture or simply a sphere or a tiglia or essence or any syllable or a deity's face or simply just your breath, whichever object you may take, form or formless, and allowing one-pointed concentration to be there. A brief moment where your eyes, ears, nose, mouth, body, and thoughts join together to focus on that object, and within that one-pointed concentration, take your mind into breathing in, and within the out breath, as you breathe out, mingling the concentration, the one-pointed concentration with the out breath, and just as the out breath dissolves into the expanse of the space. Simple example of a single drop of water, if dropped into the ocean, that drop of water becomes the ocean. Similar to that, breathing out and the out breath dissolving into the space, if one were to pause for a brief moment, this is what we are talking about as the natural sphere. That's the very innate sphere or the expanse. Nothing very mysterious or profound about it, but as a way of saying that could be where we are. Even if it is not as passive, genuine ability to remain the simple person that is intrinsic of one's own self without producing so many different negative emotions unnecessarily is something that we are adept, we are able to do, capable of doing. Do I want anger? I don't want anger. Do I understand anger to be negative and useless for oneself and for the others? We all do that. Likewise, we can take any of the defilements, whether it is desire, whether it is ignorance, whether it is aggression or anger, hatred, jealousy, arrogance, any emotion, negative emotion, if we sit down, even a small young child can say, this is not good for oneself, not good for the others, it is not useful, nothing comes out of it. If it is given to the others, others suffer from it, have pain from it. If others give to me, I don't like it. Likewise, just as I don't like it, others don't like it too. And so we all have this common agreement that it's useless. Then, why do we do it? Natural sphere of being able to remain within the quietness, that's being possible. And at the same time, never remaining within that quietness and continually creating an action. Not only creating an action, but creating that action which we all have agreed is not useful, is not necessary, is the cause of pain and confusion. Likewise, if we are going to create genuine goodness, happiness, whether in thought, speech, or in action, that can be generated at all times. There is nobody who comes in front of one's own self, blocks the path and say, you can't generate loving kindness towards the other sentient beings. You cannot generate positive thoughts towards the other sentient beings. Don't be kind. If there was somebody jumping into my heart and squeezing the heart and saying, dare you to generate good heart towards all other sentient beings, we would have some reason, but there isn't. There is no one, and yet from that natural expanse which could generate genuine goodness to all sentient beings, at this moment, you could possibly, it is possible, to completely dismantle and destroy any aggression, any fear, any hope, expectation, restlessness, and anxiety, and yet there's this inability to do so, and we don't. There's this tightening that we continually bring about. And so from that, although the simplicity of being able to remain within the nature is intrinsic, we always encounter that invisible, unknown, with no form, with no structure, and yet very strong obstacle that continuously comes up. Hesitation, doubt, hope, fear, whatever different designations we may give to it, but if we look carefully, other than a tightening hold, a grasping hold to our own mind, we really don't have any idea what it is that causes that blunder, causes that obstacle to not being able to remain within one's own nature, that continually, seemingly pushes us to create an action. And most oftentimes, actions that we know are useless are created. Actions that we want to generate become so very difficult to generate. As the meditator, if one sincerely wants to genuinely integrate the wisdom of the Dharma into one's own life, it is essential in the beginning to become familiar with what it is that you are working with. Outer forms of practices, no matter how many mantras, recitations, visualizations, or meditations one may do, that is good. It's essential as reminders. But in terms of genuine benefit that needs to arise from the practice is through the method of the practices going inward into seeing what is it that we are working for, what is it that needs to be transformed, what is it that needs to be looked at carefully. And that comes to, traditionally we say, grasping or self-attachment. And so different names that we may give to it, nevertheless what it is that hesitation, that tightness that occurs within one's own self that often feeds into catering to what you feel at that moment needs to be protected, needs to be defended, rather than the ability to let that be and go back into one's own intrinsic nature. And so from that comes about the first basic teachings of the Buddha. For example, although that intrinsic nature and remaining within it could be integrated into every moment. And as I said, there is no reason, no cause, no one who actually creates the obstacle and says or disturbs you. There is nobody who dances in front of us and then creates the distraction from remaining within that innate nature. It's just the basic tendency to move away. It's this grasping or the tightening of the mind that moves us away from our own basic nature. And so if we are to look into and see, what does it look like, that which creates this hesitation? What is that creates the first moving away into churning all these different kinds of distraction? It doesn't have any form, doesn't have any structure, doesn't have any kind of color or shape or identity Nevertheless, in that invisibleness of that obstacle, still the power is there. And so the name technically that's always given is habitual pattern. It's just so very familiar, something that we've lived with for such a long period of time that it doesn't take much for us to even give it any thought, that we are so very familiar with it that we continue to remain. And from the perspective of karma, cause and effect, actions are created, results are formed, result becomes, again, causes of further creation of actions. And so continuity, wheel of samsara, continues to rotate. We aspire for happiness, and yet at the same time, never really remaining within the intrinsic nature. And so the simplicity is lost from that perspective. And so in that way, one could also find, as I said, the three yanas, Hinayana, Mahayana, Vajrayana teachings coming about. But in simple ways, one could also say the immense wisdom of the Buddha, followed by all the various bodhisattvas and the great teachers, in explaining the teachings from a perspective of form, from the perspective of learning. And so in that way, also after Buddha attained enlightenment, he began to then turn the wheel of Dharma through the teachings, the first, second, and third wheel, specifically wheel of Dharmas that he taught. And the first wheel of Dharma we begin to find as the basis for allowing the mind to familiarize with what may be the reason that does not allow the mind to understand the simplicity of one's own intrinsic nature. And so of all the various teachings, especially the Four Noble Truths, 3 Marks of Existence, and the 12 Interdependent Origination, that comprises mainly the topics that were taught in the first wheel of the Dharma that was turned by Shakyamuni Buddha. So if we gather them into 3 simple things that the Buddha talked about, would be 3 basic things that you and I experience at all times, and yet at the same time not deepening our analysis and understanding of it, probably because of that reason, one is not able to genuinely implement the essence of the teachings into daily life. First of which is suffering. Second being change and transformation or impermanence. And third being emptiness. Suffering, for example, if we look at this and take some time, we know what suffering is. We go through the various teachings, and most of you are familiar. Birth, old age, sickness, and death, suffering of this human existence, and varied different kinds of sufferings that are there. But at the same time, as a meditator, it becomes essential to sit down and say how broad and how much deepened is my understanding of what suffering is. How much of that suffering I simply take for granted, having studied it or looked at it, analyzing it or enumerating it into different ways, but how much time have I actually spent in looking carefully at the experiences of little sufferings that we all go through, subtle and little as it may be, basic and ordinary as it may be, but which eventually pile up into becoming causes of confusion, causes of deviation from basic awareness, from intrinsic serenity, intrinsic peacefulness of mind. And therefore, in the beginning, it becomes essential to sit for a while and to really generate a deepened sense of motivation, intention to take to heart the examination of what suffering is. And so suffering in all its varied ways that it may be, and some may really have difficulty. Probably one of the great, let's say, misfortunes of our life is that we really don't know what suffering is. And one of the problems that comes about is most spiritual persons, especially teachers, I would say, have a good life. And out of that good life comes about the ability to talk about suffering, but not really knowing what it is. And so, even as meditators, you can say, we all go through difficulties. We all experience birth, old age, sickness, and death. That's for sure. But at the same time, we also encounter probably all kinds of other sufferings or pain in our life. We lose the things that we love very much. We don't get the things that we love very much. Those that we love very much get taken away from us. That we don't want gets heaped upon us. And so all these different kinds of suffering goes about and happens in our own lives. You and I have experienced different kinds of sufferings. We don't know what it is at all. That is not what I mean. But again, if we look at the truth of what suffering is in the lives of sentient beings, you and I very often don't know what we are talking about. Intensity with which suffering is being experienced by many, many sentient beings at this moment, that kind of fear, that kind of hopelessness, that kind of genuine difficulty, that which we have not experienced at this moment, brings about a situation where suffering still is very theoretical. When suffering is very theoretical, at that moment, much of our problems get sort of blown into issues, and those are little problems. Problems where everyone doesn't agree with us. Problems where nobody appreciates us. Problems where my view doesn't get presented. Problems where that view doesn't get implemented. Problems, although they are, and they give us sleepless nights, but at the same time, given the situation of life and death and great fear and pain that is there, nothing that is actually really a very big issue. From the perspective, let's say, if I take myself as an example, probably that'll be the safest here. It's that in some ways, since I wake up to I go to sleep, we go through all kinds of problems in India, problems in the West, in Europe, in this center, in that center, with this person, with that person, with this project, with that project, and we deal with that problem every day. And towards there comes some moment when we think there mustn't be anybody who has more problems than myself, or whatever it is. Even if we don't see it that way, we get totally absorbed in that problem, and we think of what a miserable life I have. On the other hand, if we see it from the perspective of, at this moment, if I were to die, last time, if just before entering the death, and then looking back at it, even if I wasn't to die, looking back at some of the past experiences of being completely drowned in that moment of difficulty and pain, it doesn't look very bad. You actually can laugh at it from this time and say, what was I ever thinking about? It was okay. Happens, it doesn't happen, that's fine. No one really gets thrown into the throes of that pain. It simply was your wishes not being fulfilled completely, everyone not doing the way you wanted them to do things, and therefore you had a difficult time. Much of our suffering is quite like that, isn't it? And so broadening and going beyond that, but being able to look into genuine difficulties that many sentient beings go through. Part reason is who we are in today's time. You're sitting there and my sitting here is a result and culmination of good karma. A life such as this is extremely difficult to attain, all fortunate circumstances. What do we aspire at this moment? We aspire liberation and freedom. But at the same time, we all know deep down that if we are not able to attain absolute liberation in one lifetime, what do we then aspire? We aspire to have a human life with goodness, food to eat, place to stay, people we love very much surrounding us, basic awareness and understanding, a healthy body, a mind that can think and work with the teachings, meeting with the teachers and the teachings, having time to contemplate and practice, a life that is useful for oneself and a life that is useful for the others. That is what we aspire to achieve, not knowing we have done that. Thousands of lifetimes, innumerable lifetimes, of making the same aspirations, and you have gotten what you aspired for. All situations and circumstances coming in direct alignment with one another, forming the most fortunate circumstance, this moment when you are all endowed with all the qualities that constitute a precious human life. A human life in the prime moment of a good body, a body that can actually work according to your aspirations, a mind that can think and discern between that which is right and abandon that which is wrong. The ability to genuinely generate goodness in oneself and bring fruition of blessing of goodness in one's lifetime and the others. The ability to walk out of this room and generate genuine happiness in your minds and the minds of anyone that you may meet. And the freedom to refrain from doing anything wrong and being able to overcome desire, ignorance, anger, hatred, jealousy, and arrogance. You have that choice. And so, in that way, this is the moment of fruition. This is the moment of genuine culmination of all the fortunate circumstance. However, that fortunate circumstance meeting with just one single obstacle, and the obstacle is being so immersed in the enjoyment of all the fortunate circumstances that we have forgotten that there is a life beyond this. there is a life of the other sentient being who is not as fortunate as ourselves. The obstacle that arises as limiting to our wisdom and thinking that what I see, what I think, what I want and what I don't want is the beginning, middle, and the end of samsara. And everyone must confine their experiences in accordance to my experiences. What I call suffering must be a suffering for all beings. What I can't comprehend as being suffering can't be a suffering because that's beyond my own comprehension of my limiting mind at this moment. And so out of that, ignorance, what can we call it but ignorance, comes about destruction of everything good that we have built up, and a single ignorance that envelops the mind of this sensible person that can't understand what suffering is and has to resort to learning and texts and books and teachings and tapes to understand what suffering is. That is suffering. This is ignorance. This is also suffering. And so in that way, as meditators, as you sit in meditation and extend your mind outwardly towards the various experiences of sentient beings, one way of looking at it is to look inwardly into your own self and see that mark of ignorance that is there within one's own mind, that does not allow the mind to totally appreciate varied experiences of all sentient beings. And therefore, why can I not generate genuine loving kindness towards all sentient beings is because of this. Compassion needs to be memorized and learned to develop. That I have to actually go through the process of trying to find out of 6 billion human beings, one person to whom I can give selfless loving compassion in visualization, not even in actuality. That is the cause of ignorance. So when Buddha said there is suffering, then he did talk about suffering as very different kinds of sufferings of all sentient beings. From a gross perspective, he talked about birth and the process of birth and the immense pain that is there, confusion and fear that is there. Talked about old age, sickness and death, which you and I will experience, I have been experiencing. On the other hand, he also explained about suffering and the cause of suffering as being ignorance, cause of suffering being grasping. That ignorance, that grasping, which doesn't allow the sanity, the basic intrinsic sanity to be pervasive, to be active, to be able to really generate awareness, a sense of awareness of all sentient beings. And so I often feel that instead of all these different representations of the Buddha, Dharma, and the Sangha, which are, if we look at it in its authentic essence, supposed to be reminders of the teachings. But one way I think sometimes, in the modern day especially, what would be useful would be is instead of the shrine, keeping large mirrors in front of our own selves so that we can all see ourselves meditating. Isn't it? Our teachers would often say the seating style in a traditional shrine room is where each rows face one another. And he would say probably the method why it was applied in that way would be is to look into the face of one another and be embarrassed at what we are trying to do here. And so if we can't look into one another's face, one way would be is to place a mirror. If there was a mirror in front of our own selves, and we looked at the way we were meditating and the kind of attitude we were able to generate, perhaps that would be a better reminder for ourselves to begin to see the depth of ignorance that is there, unnecessary, invisible, without any form that is there, which brings about, even in meditation, so much fabrication, so much of discrimination and separation from what is authentic, from what is true. And so if we wonder why the transformation and the transcendence doesn't occur, it doesn't occur simply because suffering is not understood. Cause of suffering is not understood. Suffering, if it is confined to being blood-spattered, ugly little children or animals being and dying in a very ugly and a non-beautiful way, or all the blackness and the bleakness and the gloom of the third world countries and the disasters of the war and hunger and famine, if that is what is our limiting understanding of what suffering is, that often does not give us the courage to look into the eyes of each sentient being and see same hope, same fear, same restlessness. And so not doing that, not confining one's understanding of suffering to only be visually ugly or visually great, sorrowful, or painful, the shrieks and the shouts and the cries and the blood and the different kinds of different forms of the suffering that are there, but to be able to really look into something that's beautiful, and yet the inability to generate kindness. When you look at the number of activities that are happening as meditators sitting in meditation and seeing the whole world in movement at all times. Everyone seems to be in constant movement everywhere. So even as we drive here, the nuns and we all talk about it, is how strange it is to see the entire world in movement constantly. You go to the airport and you almost think everyone is at the airport. You go on the freeway and almost no one seems to be at home. Everyone is on the freeway. You go to a marketplace, everyone seems to be there. You go to a mall, everyone seems to be there. And so in that way, where everything is in constant movement, everyone isn't doing some activity or the other, it is for the same thing, same search, same way of everyone wanting happiness, no one wanting suffering, and therefore in action, constant movement, and just as oneself, tired, as one sits in meditation, reflecting upon the tiredness that is there in the lives, in the minds of all sentient beings. Being able to see how much restlessness, anxiousness, anxiety there is in the minds of all sentient beings. And from that, deepen the sense of understanding what suffering is. Suffering is to have the quality of genuine peacefulness intrinsic of one's own self, and yet being so distant from it, never finding time to pause, never finding time to rest. Just as in one's own experience, knowing that there is no obstacle to that peacefulness that is intrinsic of one's own self, and yet unknowingly, without that will, without that choice, there is this constant push, constant pull, ignorance, or the cause of suffering, desire, grasping, whatever we may call it. All of these different terms that we may use, the single force that constantly moves the mind away from its stillness, from its intrinsic awareness, and therefore all kinds of restlessness, hope, and fear that is there. Being able to look or pause and see into the minds of all sentient beings and have a sense of hope, constant want, constant craving, constant desire, aspiration, want of happiness, we could simply say that. And at the same time, restlessness and anxiety that even at the moment when one experiences some kind of happiness, there is still fear, there is still a sense of one might lose this, and the anxiety, the restlessness that comes about. So much restlessness that even meditation becomes so very distracted, that even in single moment of one-pointed concentration, how difficult it is to bring about freedom from that anxiousness, from that restlessness. And so endowed with so many good qualities, endowed with that ability to genuinely abide within one's own intrinsic nature, and yet how very strong the current of distraction, of hope and fear is there that does not allow the mind to rest, and therefore being able to see that this is how then we create suffering that is not wanted, suffering that nobody wants. Nevertheless, how easily we move away from the intrinsic nature of peacefulness, and that moving away again has full implications of karma. So moving away simply doesn't remain moving away. As soon as you move away, you say something, you do something, you create something. Karma is created. Knowingly, unknowingly, we have created a cause. Each cause has the propensity to again become fruitioned, and fruitions again multiply into many more causes, and in seamless, endless, limitless number of causes and creations occur, and rotation, cycle, or the wheel of samsara, wheel of actions, cause and effect, continually is manifest. So we want happiness. Nobody wants suffering. And yet with that simple inability to abide within one's own intrinsic awareness, we then create causes and conditions that do not always give rise to favorable circumstances, and that again fruitions as different experiences, birth, old age, sickness, and death, and different manifestations or effects of the karma that arises from aggression, that arises from desire, that arises from ignorance and arrogance. All of these then display in its various ways. We bring about anger among our own selves and lack in peacefulness of mind and body. Similarly, there's craving and desire that influences our actions, and we generally create a chaos in our own environment. and that environment which we don't like. Then we go back again into aspiring freedom from that environment. And so this endless way of going back and forth comes about. And so the Buddha taught suffering and the emphasis in first making each meditator take time to reflect upon that suffering. And so as in meditation, reflecting upon it, as in the process of meditation, one could simply generate awareness of the different existences, different beings who are going through tremendous suffering, and allowing the mind to look into varied degrees of suffering that are there. On the other hand, it is far more helpful in many ways to take that into a post-meditation practice. It's to be able to devote time to quietness and silence, not so much constantly falling into the pattern of judging things as they happen, but experiencing things as they arise. It is not necessary at the beginning to solve a problem immediately. If it can be solved, by all means, and if you want to, if you can do, then you should. But on the other hand, as you go into contemplating and examining the nature of suffering and trying to understand and familiarize the mind with knowing what suffering is to give yourself time and availability to reflect upon the varied experiences that all sentient beings go through. It is not necessary to look into the eyes of another person and say, you are suffering. That's not the way we are going into it. It's to look at just the flavors of life that this person goes through, hopes of this person, apprehensions of this person, expectations of this person. Even in a simple body movement, how much hope there is, how much display there is, why is it necessary, and how do we do this? Even in a speech, how much authenticity is there? Why would we say it in that way? Why does it become necessary? Is the dependency of the happiness of all sentient beings dependent upon that speech? Why are we so demonstrative? How much expectations and hope is there in that simple speech? How much confirmation is there in that speech? How much arrogance is there in that speech? How much gentleness and goodness is there in that speech? If an action is being done, and if it is a genuine action, knowing such a good genuine action is so simple, and therefore being happy that there is that genuineness in that goodness of the action. If there is negativity, being able to see the negativity and say, this is how easily it comes about. And just as this person does it, I do it too. And so going back and forth into seeing the other's experiences and then reflecting upon one's own attitude, one's own tendencies, reflecting upon one's own needs and anxieties and how we easily demonstrate the same actions and speech and thoughts, and then being able to see that this is how it happens for all sentient beings, is introducing the mind through experience and analysis what is being talked about as experience of suffering, experience of not only plain suffering, but how easily we do create the circumstances that we all encounter. In that way, then, the mind begins to go a little bit beyond just the cushion of being able to see, oh, the experiences of other sentient beings, this is how it happens. This is how one needs to also begin to see how easily I do it, that's the way, how easily others do the same things. And just as many excuses that I come up with all the different tendencies that I generate. And we see, oh, my ignorant mind is not able to be mindful and therefore generates this quickness of sharpness of the tongue or actions that are misunderstood by the others. Likewise, when others do also, being able to see how little choice or how helpless that other person is given the circumstances of one's own habitual tendencies, and therefore being able to really go back and forth in the experiences allows the mind to, in post-meditation, be able to still work with awareness with some amount of analysis and examination. That in turn then allows the mind to become a little bit supple. It's like a tanning of the leather, is where you move the mind to think in all different kinds of circumstances. That is then good training for a meditator in post-meditation to continually work with one's own practice, with the insight that one takes from the teachings and instructions that one hears and one listens. And that's absolutely essential. I think one of the areas that we can work with probably is, in the modern world, probably would be, is the amount of talking that one needs to do constantly. If that is reduced a little bit, I think there's a lot of time and energy that is left then in watching and observing one's own attitudes, one's own conducts, as well as the others. So moments, if it does require, is to be silent. Perhaps out of that reason also comes the discipline of meditation. There was no intention, I'm sure, among the enlightened beings to put us through the rigors of the 7 points of Vajravarotana posture, to sit in that difficult posture on a round cushion, and to sit quietly for hours in meditation. But it is simply, I think, that comes out because one still can't keep quiet. It is so very difficult to remain observant and mindful of all the different tendencies of ignorance while the body is in action, while the speech is in movement, and the thoughts are rampantly producing different kinds of objectives, different kinds of judgments, different kinds of opinions. Therefore, just as in the discipline of a shrine room or as in any meditation place where you physically calm down, where you allow the disciplining of the speech to reduce the usage of speech and making sound, and train the mind to be one-pointedly focused. And therefore from that, then again, whether it is different kinds of visualizations, form and formless methods that are applied, all are methods so that body, speech, and mind can pause to become a ground of awareness. And so within the post-meditation also, whether it is walking, whether it is in different kinds of activities, whatever it may be, one thing that can be brought about is awareness, concentration on the environment as you are, not only outwardly but inwardly, learning to look at yourself and then look outward, learning to look at someone else or the situation, circumstance, and immediately going back into one's own self, going back and forth into that examination through reduction of speech and mind, as well as being able to calmly observe, allows, I think, the ability to really integrate practice and what we learn, what we study into the experiences. And that then better enhances a meditator's ability to understand what it is that we try to read and study. Many of you take a great amount of time to go through study groups and practices. Many of you, I know, spend weekends or whatever times that you are available, and some of you have, I think in the last, probably some of you that I know personally here, haven't had much life in the last few years, and that every weekend is spent in Dharma practices, every holiday is spent in doing retreats, or even if bigger blockages of times that are there, you tend to discipline yourself into doing the best that you can. That's all very, very good, and we all appreciate and understand that you do dedicate a lot of amount of time to your practice, but the squeezing of the essence, why you do it, for what do you do it, for whom do you do it, that needs to also be understood. Otherwise, you become very disciplined and rigorous and dedicated. And as one of the great masters, Drukpa Kunle, he had said, sometimes he often referred it to the monks and the nuns, and he said, somewhere between being a samsaric and a non-samsaric person is a meditator who's stuck as a Bardo realm being, neither having this nor that, and that's quite true too, is that can't enjoy samsara because you're meditators. And on the other hand, can't really become meditators, but just because you're still stuck with samsara. So somewhere in the middle, we lose out on both. Neither attain enlightenment, nor enjoy samsara to its fullest. That's a sorry state. So in that way, it is essential to be able to make a choice, and then as a practitioner, one would say, to be able to really integrate Dharma into daily life, that becomes essential. So bringing fruition and allowing the blossoming or the genuine fruition of one's own teachings and the practices that you dedicate so much of your life into bringing about result, into gaining some result, is then applying it into daily life. So that even as you sit and understand or reflect upon suffering of sentient beings, and to those beings that you generate loving kindness, that the mind that is able to expand outwardly and understand experientially what suffering is better equipped to being able to generate loving kindness. And so where the mind becomes more supple and more vast in understanding the truth of suffering, the truth of ignorance that creates so much confusion, restlessness, and anxiety. Suffering probably is too strong a word. We could simply say just restlessness, the inability to simply rest calmly within one's own self. If we reflect upon them, then generating kindness does not become a very difficult thing to do. if we observe in the lives of our great teachers and the immense compassion, limitless, selfless, unbiased compassion that is there in their minds, one thing that we can also find is that their life extends outwardly. They take and make the effort to go beyond one's own field of experience, to look into the lives of the others and appreciate the totality of their experiences, and that works with one's own mind. Oneself benefits from that. Generation of loving kindness and much more selfless and unbiased compassion more easily comes about that. When we limit our own world to simply be my problems and what I am experiencing, what I can get and what I can't get, then that of course limits one's own understanding of whatever it is that we are learning. And therefore, you look at a text and you talk about genuine selfless bodhicitta, genuine selfless compassion that needs to be extended to all sentient beings. And dutifully, we may sit in meditation and try to generate it, but because of the limiting view of the world that we have, the field of experience that we have, that limitless compassion will immediately encounter difficulties. And so it is essential, therefore, to take time to go beyond one's own life. And similar to the example of the frog in the well that we spoke about last evening, not limiting your world to your own well, but allowing the mind to go beyond and completely take time to learning about other people, to look into the other people. Oftentimes, I think we meet with many people, and sometimes out of good reason. Some of the, let's say, the bombardment sort of the different things that are on the television these days can be very distressing. So, of course, some people have great difficulty with that for whatever reasons it may be. But I had a good friend who often used to find it very difficult to watch any news on the television. And so she used to work very hard in different projects that I would, but we would always have an argument. I would make her sit down and watch the news on the television, and she would then complain the next morning she couldn't go to sleep at all because of what she saw on the television as look into the various experiences. As you sit by a busy street and doing nothing but seeing the movement of just the cars that go in search. That simply could be a simple thing of reflecting or meditating upon search of happiness, in search of something, restlessness and the movement and the different chaos that we create in our own life, and I, at this moment, doing the same thing. What is the difference between that person and this person? In search, so that even in the briefest of the brief moment of meditation, mind is always agitated, mind is constantly in movement. When it is in movement, again, it creates action. And therefore, in that same sequence, being able to go back again and again, again and again, in small little bits of conversation that we have with one another, then again, while you are adoring and being responsive to the different communications that you are making, but a good way to learn about is how much we tend to simply struggle with just arrogance and ego, plain arrogance and ego in simple conversations, especially among people who meditate and those of whom we are sort of working with one another. It's a full display of what samsara is among our own selves. We simply can't talk straight and common language. There's always something to demonstrate, something, always an uphandship. I think there's always a tendency that why need to make one step further? If this person says one thing, I need to say two. If this person says two things, I need to say three. And so there's this struggle constantly. And then we practice humility and simplicity. But the humility and simplicity that we demonstrate is of martyrdom. It's almost a sense of making this other person feel utterly bad about having us practice humility. And so there's a sense of, okay, I give up. You are the worst person available, but I will practice humility and simplicity, kind of a situation here. And so every little action, if we can develop the ability to look carefully and simply ask the question, why? Why am I doing this? In the same way, just as everyone seems to do, that's the same tendency that I bring up in my actions of body, speech, and mind. And therefore, in the depth of my own mind and the intention, there is arrogance, there is ego grasping. This speech that I made was full of that arrogance, was full of that ego grasping, was full of aggression, was full of attachment to one's own self. And then coming back to again asking the question, I know this causes suffering. It is not an empty word or an empty action that exhausts. Each have a full quality of manifesting as karma. Fruitions as planted, so will the result be. Similar to what has been planted, similar to the cause. That which I did not want. But unknowingly, again, that ignorance drives this person into creating this action so very easily. Therefore, if there is suffering, who creates that suffering other than one's own self? Therefore, from that same perspective, who would undo that suffering other than one's own self? So easily as I create, even if I am able to purify these negative tendencies that I have created, just as much as this negative tendency has the effect of affecting others' lives, similarly, transformation and transcendence can bring about just as much genuine goodness. And therefore, in meditation, what I have learned, in practice, what have I learned? How much closeness and union am I able to bring into what I have heard, into what I am practicing? That is an examination that everyone must bring about. And so, first contemplation would be suffering, working with suffering in meditation, in learning, hear teachings as many as possible, into understanding the diversities of the different kinds of sufferings that sentient beings go through. But beyond just the learning, also develop the ability to take into experience what suffering is in diverse ways, not becoming so very engrossed in the busyness of demonstrating one's own actions, but allowing the mind to be aware of the experiences of the others, the other sentient beings. And so oftentimes in the monasteries, we encourage younger monks and nuns especially to save lives of animals, for example. And there are moments where our teachers have emphasized that they go into the butcher's shops on any day without any prior notice to go and buy all the animals that are going to be slaughtered on that day. And this is a simple way. It's a simple way, but at the same time works very effectively for all those who are renunciates, young people especially, who are renunciate monks and nuns, to be able to see what death actually means. Sitting with a full stomach, well clothed, in a very nicely kept shrine room, contemplating on impermanence becomes very difficult, isn't it? It isn't that we didn't know or don't know what impermanence is, but again, habitual tendency of the mind being such, impermanence doesn't really strike to us as being imminent at this moment, and therefore some amount of consolation is what we give to our own selves, and we never understand fear of death. Second mark of existence that the Buddha taught, change and impermanence. Change and impermanence is constantly there. Suffering, part of it is that the suffering arises because of ignorance, one of the suffering being death. At the same time, much of everything that we make and seemingly make it very important for our own selves. This frog in the well syndrome, let's say, or the simply being so very absorbed in our own little world of happiness and suffering, is because the moment of impermanence and change and death has never really occurred to us. And so we contemplate, and as the various teachings talk about and the Buddha talked about, everything is in transition, everything is changing, everything is in constant movement, and therefore be able to really let go of the grasping, let go of making big issues out of the simple things. Aggression, ignorance, and desire is something that we can do without, doesn't need to be kept simply because at the moment of death, it brings about more pain for ourselves, doesn't do anything good. And so a simple way would be is to see all the different issues that we make very important, some things that we really struggle with in our own lifetime. But according to the teachings, one of the good ways to meditate upon that is to every moment see if this was the last moment that you had as a person alive. How many of that issue would really be an issue at that moment? Would it at that moment truly become necessary to hold on to it so very strongly? Especially when we encounter difficulties that seem to be an obstacle in generating kindness, in generating forgiveness, in generating gentleness and generosity, being able to work with this second mark that the Buddha talked about, the second truth that the Buddha talked about, impermanence, becomes essential. In meditation, we learn about it. In practice, when you listen to teachings, innumerable teachings talk about reflecting upon impermanence and change, and we have heard about it. We look at the seasonal changes, we look at yesterday and today, we look at all the movement of time that is occurring, we look at our breath, we look at the number of people who we knew have died, we look at people who are about to die, we look at ourselves and see the changes that have occurred through the years. And simple ways of saying it is we look at our teachers, magnificent, great, enlightened beings from whom we receive teachings who are no longer alive today. If we look at our own selves and the movement and the changes, physical changes that are occurring, change and impermanence is there. At the same time, however, so much literal and philosophical, theoretical knowledge that we may have, yet again, at that same time, that confidence that should be there in impermanence is not strong enough, and therefore suffering continues, ignorance continues to manifest. And so in ways of working with the impermanence, within each day of a practitioner's life, again, contemplating upon death and change and impermanence is necessary. In some cases, people often say the paralyzing fear that arises and grips the mind when it reflects upon death and impermanence, and how scary that can be. And although in some ways a paralyzing fear can be a negative connotation, paralyzing fear would mean a fear so strong that you're not able to go beyond that, and that's not the intention of contemplation on impermanence. But if it is a strong fear that grips the mind, then it's a good fear. It's a fear that should be there. And as Milarepa said, fearing death, he took on the path of the practice and practiced it so well that no longer there was any fear of death. And so the fear of death simply is there because our basic awareness knows the non-usefulness and the non-necessity to grasp so much at those things that are making our life very difficult and very, very difficult to overcome. And so whether it is anger, an immense aggression that we feel for the others, the immense inability to go beyond the diverse manifestations of hatred, of fear, of aggression, and all these subtle variations and branches of anger that is there in our own minds, and how we hold on to it, and we make life very difficult. We can't even bring the face of that person into our mind, and immediately that gives us either hatred or gives us anger or simply gives us discomfort. Even as a person who wants to be free of that aggression, often that person's simple remembrance of that person brings about discomfort in the mind. It may not be hate or anger to that person, but it certainly is discomfort. It is about not liking this person at all. And so we spend enough time doing that. We go through that. On the other hand, loving kindness becomes biased because we're so absorbed in self and those that we love, and an indifferent attitude comes about towards most sentient beings. Emotional difficulties of, let's say, disappointment or sorrow or sadness that comes about, everything that we are all experiencing that grips our own mind. A simple way of looking at it would be is, I could be a better person were it not for this particular difficulty. Whether it is grasping to self, whether it is anger towards somebody, whether it is some sense of not being able to overcome a particular emotional discomfort that one may be experiencing at this moment. Everything else is okay. I can be kind to all the sentient beings, but this problem. You sit in meditation and you extend loving kindness to all sentient beings. But there are these ones or twos who could wait a while, and you need to process them through some time before you actually be able to include all of them. And even if we do include them, it's with an indifference. Somewhere along the back rows, you've just included them in, but you don't really want to spend time going into working with them. Those are little things and simple grasping, ignorance of the mind that bring about the grasping. Nothing changes. You're thinking about them, not thinking about them, not much changes. As the teachings often say, sun continues to rise and shine and rain falls and life goes on. This person probably doesn't even know of your discomfort relating to this person. His and her life continues to flow. What does become entangled is the karma that we create. A mind doesn't or isn't able to understand that tightening and tightening the fist and holding on to that which is an obstacle to the path of the practice, there is nothing to hold on to it. But because you allow it to be enough or strong enough to stumble upon, that what it does is impedes one's own ability to have calmness of mind, to genuinely be able to gain some genuine happiness in one's own self. And therefore, if that kind of difficulty is what we are experiencing, then again, as many of the teachings, especially the teachings of Khandro Rinpoche, when he talks about, is to sit down and to clearly reflect upon change, transition, transformation that is coming. Each breath as we take in, the uncertainty of whether we are able to breathe out again. When we breathe out, uncertain that we are able to breathe in again, so fragile this life being. And therefore, from that perspective, sitting down and pausing and to think about is, at the moment of death, what is really useful? What is it that can really be a source of genuine consolation, genuine cause of happiness, sense of fulfillment and completion to one's own self? And so not only just giving it a cursory glance, cursory examination often will lead to a sense of being self-consoling, where we think, oh, I've done the best I could. If others understood, that would be good. If others didn't understand, it's their loss. My intention was good. I did the best I can. We tend to, at this moment, some ego display is there where we are still quite sure that nothing disastrous or death is going to happen at this time. So we may not, but in rigors of truly contemplating upon them, especially as you go to sleep, and then being able to bring the mind inward and think, if this was the very last moment, and then you look back and see all the difficulties that you held on to, that you grasped to as being very strong, would that give you an extra breath? Would that give you an extra moment of happiness? Who, having held on to it for so many years, at this moment of death, whom can you pass this on to? How can you sustain it? How can you keep it? What good does that do to you? How can you benefit from it in any way at that moment of death? It's a good way to look back and then to see, in living moment, why would one make it into an issue? Why would one hold on to it for so long? When death comes, when change comes, when impermanence comes, whether we are willing to or whether we are unwilling to, there is nothing that can be taken by that person into the experience of death other than karma, other than what you have created. If it is a good cause that one has created, whether we get the effects of it or not, depending on whether you believe life after death or not, but that it is a cause that was good, and there's happiness from that. But the cause, negative cause, that we have created, and then knowing that it was useless, it was not necessary, to have lived that many number of years, and to not really have done anything genuinely helpful to this person or to one's own self, is very, very sad. Being able to reflect upon that also becomes necessary. So if I look into my own self, and then as a necessary daily practice, one should do it. Each day you have lived another day, and then you look back and say, and often as I can, one just try to bring that into one's practice and see. And the 36 years of my life and reflecting upon what good it has done. Cursory glance and surface would be, you can always console yourself and say, you said many things, you did many things, you started many things, and so on and so forth, and did the best you could. But if one is realistic, if one really looks into the genuine benefit that may have arisen, there is nothing at all that can be said to be truly beneficial to oneself and to the others. So in that way, each moment as a meditator reflects upon change and impermanence, as the Buddha talked about, the truth of impermanence. And in the context of the truth of impermanence, what is the relevance of all the actions that I have been doing? There never was a day in these 36 years, one could say, when one was sitting still. Every moment is a moment of performing actions. Speech, especially, the very little time to be quiet, always saying something, always doing something. It's a wonder, as I always say, that the lips never got worn out. Is that it's constantly there. And at the same time, the sort of boiling it down to the sound that you have been making for the last 36 years. And what does it come into honestly? An honest approach and a realistic approach of seeing, at this moment, if I was dying, to say, of all the speeches that were made, what is the nyingpo? What is the essence of that speech that could be really said to be, oh, this is what I have given as the sort of mountain of speech and sounds that I have made that are truly useful, and this you can have to the other sentient being, other than a sense of consoling yourself into believing that you might have said something that's helpful to the others in a concrete way, in a real essential way, there's nothing. And it's 36 years of incessant sound making that has been there. Their mind, then millions and millions and millions of thoughts that we have generated in all these number of years, 36 years in my life. And if at this moment one were to sit and search for something that was pure, something that was genuinely good, that could be useful for the others, and if not for the others, at least for one's own self, other than an assumption that there might, in the midst of those millions of thoughts, something that could be good. And even that is consolation. In terms of genuine goodness of the heart, very, very little, very, very few. And therefore, in that way, then one could ask the questions, what am I doing? Is that not suffering? Is that not mark of ignorance? That an unceasing stream of actions of body, speech, mind are occurring. In meditation, as I sit still and I try to understand the nature of mind, why is the nature of mind becoming so difficult to understand? Is that it is clouded in actions of body, speech, in the actions and the different appearances of the thoughts that are occurring. And therefore, when I am busy with what is occurring and the outer form, how can the true nature be understood? When the true nature is not understood, how can selflessness arise? Wanting grasping, non-grasping, wanting selfless compassion for all sentient beings, wanting liberation from ignorance and self-grasping. Aspiring is good in meditation, but that the aspiration blossoms into fruition is going to be dependent upon being able to deepen the awareness of the true nature, and that true nature at the moment is clouded. Clouded because I have eyes, but I'm not able to see beyond my own experience. Clouded because I can hear sounds, but immediately each sound gets walked into my own opinions and judgments. That I have the ability to think and to experience, but then it gets again and again mingled into judgments and opinions, and a world that I create of my own, and so much self-grasping and so much selfishness being there. Therefore, one encounters the difficulty of not being able to generate genuine forgiveness, compassion, kindness, gentility. And so this is ignorance. This is again and again the way I again and again encounter difficulties. May I, as a meditator, be able to truly remember that, remind myself. There is no such thing as meditation and post-meditation. May I, as a person with the body, with the mind, be able to continue developing awareness of all moments. With the eyes, be able to look into what I am creating, see what others are creating. With the speech, listen to my sounds as well as learn to listen to the sounds that are made by the others. Listen to and hear, be aware of the thoughts that occurs and the thought that influences the actions of the others. And as a meditator, may I be able to closely observe this samsara that we have created and see the cause. And if that cause of ignorance is what is understood, and I glimpse how powerful it can be, then may I turn my mind to the Dharma. And this become the reason why I practice and meditate, is to overcome this ignorance, overcome this cause that creates so much suffering in oneself and the others. And so that should be the first motivation. And with that motivation, then one can go into different forms of practices, different forms of learning, different forms of hearing. Third mark of ignorance, third mark that the Buddha taught would be then emptiness. And so we can talk about that later in the afternoon. I think also part of the text that I would like to do is Lochen Dharmashri, one of the great teachers and masters of Tibetan Buddhism. And within many of his works, there's a very, what is known as a simple text, but nevertheless, a text that can be immensely beneficial for most of us on the path of the practices, is that having gone through the 3 marks that the Buddha talked about, reflecting upon suffering, on impermanence, and on emptiness, and through that, turning the mind to the Dharma. And in turning the mind to the Dharma, developing the qualities of the practitioners. And so it's a simple text that is said to be, what are the qualities a meditator should have? And qualities of a teacher, qualities of a student, particularly how the different qualities that are necessary that be present in Dharma practitioners. And so part of the text, not the entire text, but certain excerpts is what I will start doing from the afternoon session. Okay?